If you are new to point-and-click adventure games and want to pick out just one title to familiarize yourself with the genre, this game would be an excellent choice. Hello again and welcome to Retro Games in Rally English. My name is Juho Kuorikoski, I'm a Finnish journalist and a non-fiction author, and I'm here to talk about old games in my very Finnish English. I'm very excited because in this video we will be taking a closer look to one of my all-time favorite games. Gabriel Knight's Sins of the Fathers is probably one of the best adventure games ever made, and in my opinion the best title in the whole lineup of Sierra's games. This game is just brilliant. It has well-crafted story, excellent atmosphere, stellar structure and believable characters. These are all perks of an excellent adventure game, and then some. If I had to pick just one adventure game I'd recommend for those new to the genre, I'd pick up Gabriel Knight in a heartbeat. This game is yet another product of the 90s, but how has it aged? Let's find out. Gabriel Knight is an aspiring author and a bookstore owner. He's writing a book about mysterious murders that have been happening around New Orleans. These crimes have something to do with the local voodoo traditions, so there's definitely interesting material to investigate. Gabriel is, however, suffering from recurring nightmares that are somehow linked with the murders, or at least voodoo. The more Gabriel investigates the subject, the more he gets pulled in with the mysterious past of New Orleans and his own bloodline. Sierra's Adventure Game Factory had produced dozens of adventure games before Gabriel Knight was released. This game breaks the traditional Sierra formula in many ways, as it is much more story-oriented than other adventure games released by this point-and-click behemoth. Gabriel Knight is first of all a story that has a thick atmosphere. It really doesn't need the characteristics of an adventure game to shine. Interestingly enough, the only downsides of this game are linked directly to pointing and clicking. As Gabriel Knight is a point-and-click adventure game, it's constructed around story, dialogue and puzzles. Although the game emphasizes the narrative and especially atmosphere, progressing the plot is done by the means of an adventure game. The dialogue is written extremely well and there's a lot of it. Usually this wouldn't be a positive thing. Generally speaking, all the stuff not relating to puzzles or story is just a filler in adventure games, and for me at least, it gets annoying pretty fast if I have to click through nonsense. With Gabriel Knight, it's a different story. Every character is written so well that you actually enjoy just to find out what they are thinking. This is very rare, and it speaks in volumes about the talent of Jane Jensen, who wrote, directed and designed the game. Gabriel Knight is structured very different when compared to the other adventure games of the same era. The game is divided into 10 days. Each of the days is an episode of sorts with its own goals, puzzles and storyline. When certain goals are achieved, the day is done. It's not uncommon that adventure games are structured to acts, which are, in a sense, episodes as well. But Gabriel Knight takes this concept a bit further. Dividing the whole game to days feeds the atmosphere extremely well, as each day the plot gets literally thicker. I argue that the biggest reason for the haunting atmosphere on Gabriel Knight is this episodic structure. The game falls a bit apart towards the end, and the last third isn't as good as the rest of the game. This is only a minor complaint, as the game delivers amazing storyline that keeps you on your toes for the most part of the adventure. It's a bit sad that the game isn't able to deliver the climax of the story in the same force as the build-up towards it, but when the end credits roll, you feel satisfied. Audiovisually, Gabriel Knight is still beautiful. Despite the low resolution, the game still looks very pretty, and you can always trust your imagination to fill the gaps. The soundtrack is excellent thanks to the score of Jane Jensen's husband Robert Holmes. Voice acting was done by professionals. There are talents such as Tim Curry and Mark Hamill in the roles, so this time I can actually recommend the CD edition instead of floppies. Hamill and Curry don't provide their best performances, but the voice acting is as a whole very enjoyable. Because Gabriel Knight is an adventure game, there needs to be puzzles. Although the game is constructed better than many of its competitors, the puzzles are definitely the weak spot of the game. If Gabriel Knight would have been released today, it could get away just by concentrating on the story, in the same manner as the Telltale's interactive drama games. Things were very different in the 90s, and basically adventure games were the only way to get a character-driven atmospheric crime story out there in a form of a digital game. Just to clarify, the majority of Gabriel Knight's puzzles are totally okay, but there are a few exceptions. This mine puzzle is a good example. Getting this clown to follow you is a total nightmare, and the logic behind the puzzle was pretty far-fetched. Thank God for walkthroughs. There are sudden deaths, but the game is quite merciful in this regard, especially compared to the other Sierra titles. But you should always remember to save, and in multiple slots, just to make sure. As a whole, Gabriel Knight is a competent adventure game well worth the praise, even today. But it's quite obvious what are the strong sides of the game and where does it stumble. Don't be alarmed, my complaints are very minor, and as seasoned adventure gamers who probably are already familiar with the game can ignore them. In a game this good, even the smallest problems stand out. If you are new to adventure games, you should definitely check the game out, and I actually recommend that you do so, even if Gabriel Knight is your first classic adventure game. Just focus on the story, there's no shame to use a walkthrough. Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers was one of the first games targeted towards mature audiences. Sure, sex and gore were used in games well before Jane Jensen designed her masterpiece, but Gabriel Knight takes a different approach. The game is first and foremost an interactive story that is constructed in a very mature way. It's an interactive novel, which is a high praise for a game that was released in the 1990s. The atmosphere is borderline haunting, the characters have clear motivations, and the rich background material roots the fiction in facts. This combination of fact and fiction is the cornerstone of the narrative and an excellent example of the talent behind the game. Gabriel Knight is basically a solo project of Jane Jensen, a game designer at Sierra who cut her teeth in King's Quest VI. She worked in Sierra's mentoring program with Roberta Williams. Jensen worked as the project lead, but Williams supervised the production. After King's Quest VI was finished, Jensen pitched her own project and got it approved. Sierra's CEO Ken Williams had faith in Jensen's idea, although the game concept was very different when compared to other games Sierra had released. It was a gamble. Jensen was granted total freedom in creating the game, but the downside was that if the game would fail, it would be the first and last project she would lead at Sierra. According to Jensen, the central idea of the story revolved around Inquisitors. She wanted to write a story that focused on bloodline of witch hunters, but the events would take place in modern times. This idea evolved into the general plot of the game. Religious themes were introduced to story mainly because of Jensen's family background. Her father was a priest. Other sources of influence were works of Neil Gaiman, Sandman and Hellblazer in particular. Jensen's trademark in writing is a clever mix of real and make-believe. Gabriel Knight is a perfect example of this. According to Jensen, adding real history to fiction makes the story more believable and it gives it a deeper meaning. The concept of voodoo is heavily rooted into reality, as well as New Orleans where the game takes place. There's also a historical background behind voodoo and New Orleans, and Gabriel Knight roots this in its narrative. When this is combined to the modern-day witch hunting, the story as a whole becomes an interesting mystery that you just can't stop playing. While the story is well written and interesting, the game also portrays very believable characters. Gabriel Knight, our hero, starts out as a total douchebag, but during the game he grows into his new responsibilities. Although he starts out as an aspiring author, Destiny has different plans, and as the story progresses, Gabriel has to embrace his family's past. He has to become something more than just an egoistic wannabe author. While the game is a classic in every sense of the word, it wasn't a huge commercial success. Combined sales with the sequel, The Beast Within, were around 300,000 units. The game sold well, but not extraordinarily well. The reception was lukewarm among critics as well. Gabriel Knight was so different when compared to other Sierra games that many of the critics couldn't make heads or tails of the game. In Finland, the press absolutely fell in love with the game, as did the players. Later, many others have come to their senses too. But as the years passed, Gabriel Knight's reputation grew. The sequel was well received, although it was done with the god-awful FMV technology in the same vein as was Phantasmagoria. The third Gabriel Knight installment, Blood of the Sacred, Blood of the Damned, became the last adventure game of Sierra, a worthy send-off to one of the most influential game companies in history. Gabriel Knight doesn't underestimate the player. You need to be ready to deal with the stuff the game throws at you. Gabriel Knight is the first game that I actually felt genuine fear while playing the game. There's a remake available, but unfortunately this graphics update doesn't capture the feel of the original. There's no way to switch between the new and the old graphics mode, as was the case with the Monkey Island remakes, so my suggestion is that you go with the original. There's been rumors about a fourth Gabriel Knight game, but unfortunately they fell silent after the release of the remake. The plans for a possible sequel were linked to the sales of the remake, which apparently weren't stellar. Jane Jensen has stated that the fourth game would revolve around witchcraft, but she's also stated that this might or might not be the case. Hopefully someday we will find out the truth, but in the meantime we'll just have to deal with these three magnificent games. The sequels aren't as good as the original, but well worth the title of a classic. But those two games deserve their own videos. I think we're done with shadow hunting for one day. As always, the race was hard, tire was bad. Until next time, Kuorikoski out.